Wabash Carnegie Public Library Oral History Program, interviewing Jerry Jontry, 440 East 57th Street, New York City, Sunday, July 11th, at the home of Glenn Bowman. Well, Jerry, the first question I want to ask you is just give me your background as to your family and grandparents and where you were born in your early childhood.
Surely. On my father's side, they all came from Switzerland. The name used to be over there T-S-C-H-A-N-T-R-E. Unfortunately, somebody along the line over here changed it to J-O-N-T-R-Y, which was a much easier name to handle. Although, I've had to laugh through the years, if I don't use my full name of Jerry Jontry, a man returning a phone call will frequently ask for Mr. Tree. But my sister has traced the family back. They all came over, that group, in 1834. And when we were in Zurich, not Zurich, but Bern, Switzerland, I tried to get a little more background on him. And this nice man from the archives, and a little fellow with a goatee and a white coat, was very helpful. And we found a little town north of Bern, Tuchers, where they came from. Sure enough, they were on the record because the Swiss keep a record of everything. And then all of a sudden, he got embarrassed. And I said, "Doctor, what's wrong?" And he said, "Well, I hesitate to tell you this, but he said there was a rule in Switzerland at the time of law that you couldn't emigrate unless your bills were all paid. And he said, I find no record of your ancestor leaving." And I said, "Perfectly all right. That fits in perfectly with the pattern in the family." He said, "But it is quite a feat for a man to leave with a wife and 9 children and come to the United States." Then they came to Ohio, and where we know where most of them were buried, but we've never been able to find the graves of the old man and his wife, my ancestor over here, Jacob Jontry. But we have a reason to believe that they're buried somewhere here in Indiana, because they moved around to Swiss colonies, and there was one there. Isn't there a Buena Vista, Indiana, down here? And I think there are a lot of Swiss buried there. But then they lived, my grandfather lived in Huntington, and then moved on to Indiana, or to Illinois, and that's where the name was changed in Illinois. You know, my mother's side, they were all of Irish and English descent, but they were all, that branch were all engaged in farming in Illinois. My father grew up, he was an apprentice painter at age, I think, about 11, but he started out on buggy wheels in Orion, Illinois, and from there on he became an expert in painting, decorating churches. He decorated churches all over Indiana. And at 19 he was in charge of a crew for a company out of Chicago. And my sister has a list of all the churches, but he specialized in that for years, and then wound up in Galesburg, Illinois, owning a paint factory. And that's how we moved to Galesburg. Galesburg is a spot in history because of Carl Sandburg and Lincoln that was one of his stops on the circuit when he rode, and also a scene of one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates there. So really my background is largely Illinois, except for I think it was 6.5 years in Indiana. The thing that has struck me about the differences in grandparents, for instance, mine, and generations today is the change in physical stature. I had 5 uncles on my father's side, and they were all given to nicknames in those days. And I was 21 years old before I knew what the first names of my uncles were, because it was Uncle Speck and Uncle Shorty and Uncle Dutch. But they were all short men. And, for instance, I towered above my father, and I noticed my cousins all did. And, of course, now that I'm here in Wabash and seeing the children of people that I knew, they're all tall, much taller. And but as you go through looking down, you can see the traces of the characteristics of facial things, and also personalities that come along. My grandfather was a shoemaker in Chenal, Illinois. And my sister showed me just last week one of the lasts that he used in the shop that he had there. But in those days, shoemakers still made shoes from scratch. And it seems like just a short time ago, yet I'm 65 today, so really we're talking about 60 years, or we're talking about 50 years ago at least, when I can remember my grandfather still making shoes. And I think one of the things that the kids miss today, that we used to have so much fun, since my mother's family were all farmers, and we lived in a town so small that you were practically on a farm. I think there's 600 people. When I talk to friends today about farming in the old days, well, I sound like a real expert. But the things they missed are things like the old threshing runs. And I'm sure they had them around here. I don't know if any of your other people have ever covered the threshing run. Well, in those days, each farmer raised his grain, and he would chop it himself, the wheat, and they'd cut it and bind it. They had binders which they operated themselves, but then they would bind it and put it in stacks, around the field. Now, no one could afford a threshing machine, so one man would own it in town, and that was his whole business. And then when it came threshing time, they would hit each farm, 3 days here, 3 days the next one. And all the other farmers would come and help that farmer, bring their horses and wagons, and they would pitch the grain into the bundles, into the cart, or into the wagon. They would take that up to the threshing machine, throw it in. That would separate the grain from the stalk, and then the wagon would take it off to the grain elevator. And then they would get all through that and move on to the next one. Well, what made it so great was all the wives would also cooperate by cooking the meals. And I tell you, those meals at noon, of course, those fellows were out there at sunup, and came noon, they were hungry. But I never saw such food as they used to have, and that it would eat like horses. And then they would all take a short nap and then back into the field. Well, I caught the tail end of that. I was old enough to be a water boy. And I tell you, it was a thrill of threshing season because it would last, several weeks until we got it all in. And, of course, there were the corn husking. When I was a little boy, they didn't have a corn husking contest. That was a later development. But that grew tremendously through the years till it became a national event. And we used to have a competition here in Wabash. And it was here on the paper. And I used to be honored by being the referee. I didn't know too much about it, but I was the referee on horseback. But these fellows would pick. They would pick, I think, for 2 hours. And it was stripped to the waist, no matter how cold it was. And those ears of corn would go against that bang board. They're picking by hand. Go against the bang board till it would sound like a drum. That's how fast they would pick. But today, of course, they have machines to do all that. So the corn husking contest is gone by the way. Yeah. And I suppose new things will take their place, but I can't see it having a contest in machines.
Yeah. What did your grandparents on your mother's side look like, physically, and on your father's side?
Well,
you mentioned them being short on your father's side.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to describe. I know my maternal grandfather was always bald. And I never could figure out when I was a boy why I always saw him in a hat. And I found out why, because he was bald. He had a big walrus mustache. And he was a short man. My grandmother was a pistol. She was full of energy. But it seemed to me in those days that we were forever going to Towanda, where they lived, for a funeral, because families were large and people died younger. And it seemed to me that I was forever going down there to a funeral as a boy. But having your grandparents in the immediate vicinity, that's what I call 30 miles immediate vicinity, it made for a larger family group than I think that you get today, where people separate, go thousands of miles away to live, and nothing seems to tie the family together like it did in the old days. But they had to amuse each other in those days, too. You would have things like television and whatnot. So there were more activities, more personal things that you did. And who's to say it was a better time? Who knows? But it was an interesting time.
Do you see any physical characteristics in any other members of the family that would look like the grandparents?
Yes, particularly among my cousins who still live in Chinook, Illinois. My uncles all had Roman noses, and they do. I got one from my mother, and I think I got the combination of the two. I got her length, but I didn't get quite the bump my father got. But it gets weeded out, as you get several generations. So you can't say they were all bronze, but my grandfather, for instance, spoke high. He called them high and low German. They were two different kinds of German. But otherwise, the language then began to die out as generations came on. Of course, the school systems have all changed. But in a small town like Chenal, you started in, actually the grade school and high school were all in one building. And you started in first grade all the way through. But of course, we moved around a bit in Indiana, Illinois. We moved to Gridley, Illinois, and then we moved to Pontiac, and we moved to Galesburg, where I finished high school. And in those days, none of the Jontrys had ever gone to college. And my mother made sure that my sister and I were going to do it. Well, of course, the thing that got me interested in college was the fact that I was interested in athletics. And in high school, I found that I was a lousy basketball player. I was too small to play football. And so I wound up running. And so then I wanted to go on, so I went to the University of Chicago for 4 years. I had a wonderful 4 years up there. Since then, on the Jontry side, everybody's gone. Of course, lots of kids go to college today. One of them has his doctor's degree. Another one is a school superintendent, and right along the line. So as you look back, you can see how they've all come into the system of education. And it was after that that I went into the advertising business when I got out. Because I got out in 1933, and that was the bottom of the Depression. And it wasn't a question of what you wanted to do, it's what you could find to do. And when I think of what some of these youngsters are starting at, salary-wise, when they get out of college today, I had to go back and remember that when I got out in 1933, I went to work for $60 a month. And almost didn't make it, but everybody does. And so then I went into the advertising business in Chicago, representing newspapers. And that's how, in the course of time, I came in connection with the Nixons.
Yeah. What was the first job? Yeah.
The first job out of school was selling advertising space for a string of newspapers, mostly in Pennsylvania at that time, but I was a Chicago manager. I didn't actually know what I was doing, but it didn't take long to catch on. And so then I began to look around for papers in the Midwest to represent, and that's how I came up against the Nixons, who then at that time owned Wabash, Peru, and one of the papers in Michigan City. Now I think the interesting thing about the newspaper business at that time was I'm told that Wabash at one time had as high as 5 daily newspapers. Now they couldn't have all been successful, but they were there. And the bitterness is something to behold. I mean, the fights would go on. They would do this, they would do that, anything to gain. But eventually, with economic conditions and whatnot, they became consolidated so that, for instance, Mr. Nixon, I'm sure, consolidated the papers here till he had just one, in the same way in Peru. But I got in on one of the last newspaper fights in Michigan City. There were still two papers there. He owned one, and they owned the other. But across the country today, and in practically every town of 100,000 or less, there is still only one newspaper. And at the rate they're going in New York, and they're down there now to 3 newspapers. Chicago only has 2, really, 2 ownerships. And it was too bad because it made it colorful, but then economically it wasn't possible to keep that many small newspapers there.
How did you live in Chicago on $60 a month in 1933?
Well,
other than very well, probably, having a job.
No, well, we didn't. 2 other boys from the University, my fraternity brothers and I, had an apartment. Those apartments were cheap, but we would wind up many a night on Saturday night with about 29 cents between us. And so you just had to watch every nickel. And then things started to get better and started to make more money, and somehow you survived.
Was there anything unusual in your college days?
No, I had 4 wonderful years. I remember I came to the University of Chicago at the same time Robert Maynard Hutchins came, and he was 29 years old. He was the youngest college president at that time, anybody. And I was 19, and he had come from being dean of the law school at Yale. One of the first things that he had to do was officially almost a week before school opened was to dedicate the new field house by laying the cornerstone. And he didn't know whether people in Chicago used cap and gowns for that kind of function. They wouldn't. He came all the way across campus carrying his cap and gown. He got over there and saw that nobody could have a cap and gown on. So I was already a self-appointed cheerleader. I had a Chicago sweater and megaphone. So I said, Mr. Hudson, I'll be glad to carry your cap and gown for you so that you can get it back home to your house. And I'll give it to you after ceremony. So he put his hand on my shoulder. He's a tall, handsome man. And he said, you're a scholar and a gentleman. And that, he went clear up to the podium and came all the way back to the crowd and put his hand on my shoulder and said, and I hope a good judge of whiskey. With that, he went up and made the cornerstone. But 4 years there under him because he was 30 years ahead of his time. Provided an exciting place to go to school. And of course, it has since gone on to become one of the great universities of the world. Great track athletes, and I was never that great, but I was good enough to get on the team, and that gave me an outlet. And then I was also engaged in dramatics at the University of Chicago, and I wrote a column on the daily paper, and I was, equally interested in that, or in the activities as I was in studies, and I'm sure that my studies suffered because of it, but that Brewster judged what the total rounded picture is. I don't know.
Did any of your classmates go on in athletics or in drama or in newspaper or writing that you remember intimately?
Well, one of my classmates went to New York with me a year later after we got out of school. We lived together there for a year, and he went down to work for Morgan Guarantee Bank. Today he's chairman of the board of Morgan Guarantee Bank. And, of course, there were a number of others who went on to things. Some went out to movies. Hal Block, who used to be one of the top gag writers. My first experience with him was I was emceeing a show on campus in Mandel Hall. And he came up to me before, and I didn't know him at the time. He said, "I've got a whole bunch of gags." I said, "Well, I really don't need them. I'm all set." He said, "No, but I'll sit up in a box, and I'll throw pennies out on the stage." Finally, you looked up and said, "Only a skunk would throw a cent." And I said, "Please." But he went on to write for George Burns and Gracie Allen and Jack Benny and all those people. Another one became Marlon Panama, became a movie producer. And then several, I'd have to stop and think, went on. And, of course, in graduate work, became leading attorneys. But the names escape me now.
Well, let's develop your newspaper career, and we got as far as getting acquainted with the Nixons.
All right.
You were acquainted with Don Nixon back in the 30s.
Only briefly. I met Mr. Nixon twice. And see, what we represent at daily newspapers is in selling national advertising. And so I called in Michigan City, and I talked to Mr. Nixon about representing the Nixon papers. And we had some preliminary conversations. And after I talked to him the second time was when he was killed. So I remember making a trip in between that with Joe and Don Nixon to Wabash. And I was saying yesterday, I didn't know these lads at all. They offered to give me a free ride to come down and talk further. And they both had derby hats on that day. That would be 1935. And I have never seen Joe Nixon on derby hat since. But at any rate, after that happened, and they started to reorganize the papers. And Bert Allen was lending a hand because he was at the bank working for Mr. Honeywell. They decided they didn't want to have the company I was, Howland and Howland, represent. They wanted me to come with the Nixon papers and handle the national for the group for them. So I joined the Nixon papers first in Peru. I stayed in Peru for about a month. I lived at the Barris Hotel, and that hotel still had the rope fire escape. Have you ever seen one? Well, it's a long rope. It hangs out. It's in case of fire. If you're on the third floor, you throw it out, and it had big knots about every 12 inches, so then you would climb down the rope. But then I went to Michigan City for a few months and then moved to Wabash. And I remember the first night I stayed in Wabash. I stayed at what is now Joe Nixon's home. Then Mrs. Honeywell had lived there with her mother. And so I stayed there. And the next morning I got up and it was snowing like mad. And I was to walk down to the plane dealer office. Well, it was snowing so, and I didn't know Wabash, and I was lost. And I reached the tracks. And I thought, well, I'll follow the tracks because that'll take me somewhere. It did. It took me almost to a grove before I got back. But then I moved to Wabash, and in a couple of years, made me general manager of the newspaper in addition to the other, and I had 6.5 wonderful years in Wabash, Indiana. To me, it was the most fun, the finest people, and at that time, I knew a lot of people all through the county. I was here, of course, when we moved out of the old computer building down to the bank building. And then, through those years, of course, came the war. And then I enlisted into the Navy, got a commission in the Navy, and left here in spring of '42. And fully intending to come back to Wabash. But as the years went by out there, on the way out, I saw California. And I decided I wanted to live in California. So when I came back, I got a job immediately the day I got out of the service as West Coast manager of Esquire magazine. And I lived out there for 9 years.
This was advertising.
Strictly advertising. Yeah. And although I did get a little fed up after 8 years, and meanwhile Joe Nixon had been wanting me to come back every year. He said, "Don't you want to come back?" So I came back. I came back to Peru and was on the paper there for a month. And again, I just California still had me. So I went back out there, and then a year or two later, I was moved to New York by Esquire. I made national advertising director, and then on up until in 1970 I became president of the publishing group, because they're a conglomerate there in lighting and education and magazine publishing and books. And I did that for 5 years until I retired last year from there. So that's some of that.
We've slid over your Navy career. You want me to fill me in on the details of where you went and what you did?
Well, you know, the Navy was a great experience because so many men served out there who had never even seen the ocean. I had never seen the ocean. As a matter of fact, the state, I learned at the time, that had the most sailors per capita population was Iowa. And but the way they were able to learn things, and of course by the time I went in I was 31. I was first in public relations in Chicago for a few months, and then I went off to sub-chaser school and just started hitting the books again. It was something. There was a man from Indianapolis, and Bill Stout, who's now with LS Air, has been many years. And we found it very difficult, but we survived and went from Princeton down to Miami to the real sub-chaser training school, and then out on destroyer escorts. So I had a little over 3 years on destroyer escorts in the Pacific. And there are many moonlight nights now, but I wish I could be back out there because it wasn't too bad a life. And but you just never got back. You were always out there. And so we had a full experience of the war out there. And really, for such a short span in your life, it created such a deep impression. I mean, you find yourself going on talking about it forever, boring people to death, you know, with the stories. But I had an interesting experience out there. There was a young woman writing a column on the Tribune, named June Provine. And so something funny happened on the ship the first week we were out there, so I sent her a report. So she published it. Didn't use my name, of course, because I said, you can't do that because it's censorship. But she said, send anything else you can. So I got in the habit of just writing envelopes and slipping them in the drawer, and once a month I'd send her the whole batch. So it turned out that once a month was a full column. So then I started having the ship's stenographer, the yeoman, make the copy, and I'd send it to my parents. They'd get it the day before, and I'd say, this may be in the Tribune line, there'd be word for word. But when the war was over, and then of course she'd send clippings, I put them on the bulletin board, so the crew loved it. You know? They were reading all about themselves in print. So when the war was over, of course, I had a full scrapbook, all printed for the Chicago Tribune of everything that had gone on.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah. When you went with Esquire magazine, now that was basically the first job that you got after the war. You had this survey over here to Peru and so forth. And who did you deal with in Esquire, starting to go in at this level?
Well, they were opening up their first office out there. They had been represented by a man who represented Fawcett Publications. And Fawcett was bringing out a magazine called True in the men's field, so there was going to be a conflict. So they had to give us. So they put in their own office, and they put me in charge to run it. So I spent those years selling advertising to advertisers on the West Coast all the way up and down.
Who hired you?
A man in Chicago by the name of Al Pastel. And it was kind of a dirty trick because we had a man on the West Coast interviewing 40 men. And meanwhile, I had gone to Chicago because I'd gotten a wire from a friend of mine that this job was open. Anyway, I was getting out of the Navy Great Lakes. So I went down and got the job. And when this man came back from the West Coast, he was really the Midwest manager, and found this out. He was so mad at me, he didn't speak to me for the first 6 months I worked for Esquire, but we became good friends thereafter. But that's how I got it.
Yeah. But you didn't deal with the family itself, and
no, it was a smart family.
Yeah.
Oh no. Then later, I dealt with the vice president in charge of advertising.
Esquire at that time, of course, was a relatively controversial magazine.
No, it was even more than that. It was a Playboy of its day.
Yeah.
But in those days, we'd never, in the history of magazine, never carried a nude. But all you had to do was have risque cartoons, and you were a risque book. But I never dreamed that the morals of the country would change to that degree. That what we call the skin books would come up as fast as what they did.
Did they have any advertising policies and so forth at that time that you felt were rather unusual for national magazines?
No. Our big problem was sell. We, of course, were limited to things that were for men. We didn't carry any food advertising. We didn't carry any women's apparel, but our big categories were liquor, because we came out, they brought the magazine out when I was a senior in college. They brought it out in 1933. Prohibition had just ended. So that opened up a whole new vista. That men's apparel, automotive, were the three basic categories in which they survived.
And how did you do as their West Coast representative?
Well, apparently well enough that they asked me to come to New York, and I had to make a decision. Did I want to stay out there where I was doing fine, or did I want to go to New York and run the risk in the Big Apple? And I finally said, well, you only live once. Let's try it. So I had 21 years with Esquire in New York after that. So it worked out pretty well.
What was the relationship with Esquire and the other big magazines in New York at that time, like the New Yorker, which of course is still going strong?
Yeah, it is. Well, you say big magazines. Esquire early in the game surpassed the New Yorker in circulation. But I wouldn't say they ever surpassed in quality. They were two totally different magazines. But the New Yorker never went out and pushed circulation. They made it by demand. And this is what I'm really going to talk about tomorrow, which is the plight of magazines today. But no, Esquire became world famous. I'll give you one example. When they first brought out the girl feature, pull-out time.
Varga or Petty?
No, first it was Petty.
Yeah.
And George Petty was making $35 a week doing commercial work for advertising agencies. And as soon as he did his first girl, he became world famous. And the more famous he became, the harder time he had to getting the one drawing a month in. And he would just make the deadline. Finally, Dave Smart, who owned the magazine, started to get rid of him. So they picked up a guy named Varga. And no time at all, Varga was known around the world. Same thing. He couldn't get in work. He just, he was sludge of success. It wouldn't work. But finally, the last time they carried a girl at all, and they dropped it, along in the early 50s, it was known as the Esquire girl. Never gave any credit to the artist. But then when Playboy came out with all girl, we just dropped it altogether, because you had to make a few months. Were you going to go that route, or were you going to go the other route? So we went out.
Did the advertising ever get in on the editorial side of it, or the content, or?
Well, always they try, but editors would shoulder you off. For instance, through the years, I'd have acquaintances saying, Jerry, I've written a wonderful piece, and would you speak to your editors? And I said, I'm sure I will. But I said, I'll tell you, you have a better chance of going another route, because for me to do it at that time, give you the kiss of death. And the publisher, you see, there used to be in the old days a publisher with the editor, and frequently the owner. But then as time went on, the publisher became somebody from the business side. And the public never, even advertising agencies, never seemed to grasp that. You'd give the man the title, because that would open doors. But it had nothing to do with the editorial. That was left strictly as it should be in the hands of the editorial people. And it's a neat trick. Some editors cannot bring off a magazine at the time you want. Others grasp it, and they're able to do it. Even good men have failed when they switch magazines, because in other words, every editor edits the magazine for himself.
Yeah.
If he's honest with himself. You ask him, who are you editing the magazine? And the honest answer is, for myself. Now, if his tastes are popular with other people, then he will try. But if they're not, forget it.
Well, you were there also in the heyday of really the heyday of advertising and the advertising agency, and they were writing books about the man in the gray flannel suit and so forth.
Yeah.
Did any of those men make an impression? I mean, you would have been dealing with them every day.
Well, yes, there were lots of them. For instance, one of the great ones was Raymond Rubicon, of Young and Rubicon. And Mr. Rubicon, when radio came along, which was before I got into the picture, but before television, he said that he didn't think radio should be used for commercial purposes. Now, here's a man with a big advert, and still is one of one of the three largest in the world. But he said he didn't think it should be used. It should be used for educational purposes. And then when television came on, he felt even more strong. And of course, there are many people in many parts of the world who feel the same as he did. But over here, his own agency, one ad today that takes more television advertising, I think, than anybody else. But he said it shouldn't be so. And now, of course, he is still alive, by the way, living out in Arizona. But he's delighted that at least PBS, Public Broadcasting System, is able to do what they do, because he feels that that's the survival of television.
Well, let's develop your present career now. And then we're going to go back on some other topics.
About a year ago, I had run across a man who had developed a business of selling advertising on the side panels of paper milk cartons. And he had run out of capital and really didn't know what to do with it because he had not been versed in advertising. But he had done all the research and found out how it would work. So we bought his company, and it fell under my wing, and I watched it for a year, and I got so intrigued with it that I finally went to Esquire and said, look, I think the time's come for us to give an amicable divorce. And by way of settlement, I'd like to buy the company from him. Well, I caught them at the right time, and I did buy it. And so for the past year, I've been developing this, so that's what I'm doing. We have today some 70 million cartons a week with the leading dairies, big ones, and supermarket chains with their own milk label. Somebody else packs it, but it comes out with their eggs. And that amounts to a coverage of about 50% of the households in the United States. So this is what we're doing.
Very good. We're going to go back now, and I'm going to ask you some questions. I just wanted to see where we were on the tape. Ask you some questions about what was your impression? Was Mr. Honeywell still living when you were here?
Oh, yes.
Yes, your impression with Mr. Honeywell and Mrs. Honeywell.
Well, of course, my impression, my first acquaintance was Mrs. Honeywell. And I didn't really know the newspaper business, and she didn't either. He had told her very little about it in these days. So all of a sudden, she found herself in charge. So she and I learned a lot of it together, and we made many trips together, and she was such a wonderful person, such vitality. And I remember distinctly one thing to show you, give you an insight into her character. Bert Allen was a real disciplinarian, and he took a great interest in papers. He didn't know anything about them either, but he was an absolute genius when it came to finance, and that was what was needed at the time to organize this thing financially. But one day, he stopped by my house. I was living there on Wabash Street in Florence Ellison's old apartment building, just at First Street, north of the track. And he stopped in there after work, and in my living room began to criticize me for something he'd done. And I got furious, remembering that a man is his castle, his home is his castle. I said, out. I threw him out. So the next morning, I told Miss Nixon about it. And she was furious, and she dressed him down. She said, if you have criticism, make it a mean boy. Do it during work hours, never now. He apologized, and we got along fine thereafter. But she was a remarkable person. Then I, of course, got to know Mr. Honeywell through connections, and I was in during the early stages when he was so interested in making films, and that's how I knew Seth Larson. And one thing that probably nobody else has mentioned, in the Alf Landon campaign, Mr. Honeywell was just determined to do everything he could to help. And he even imported a young man to write some advertising, and I placed the advertising in newspapers all around Indiana. And it was a bit of disappointment when Mr. Landon didn't show up any better than he did. And as far as I know, however, that's the only time during my term down here that Mr. Honeywell got involved in the politics. But he felt that something had to be done, so he hired him at the door.
Yeah, I carry that a little further. Just a little personal story was I interviewed one of the employees And he remembers the time that Landon did come to town, and Mr. Honeywell had everyone march from the factory on Canal Street up to the train station.
That's right.
But they saved this one man and his brother who were Democrats, and Mr. Honeywell respected him for it. But also...
Has anybody ever told the story of what Mr. Nixon did for Mr. Honeywell during the fire?
No.
They didn't? Well, of course, this happened before I got here. Now, they became friends because they were two totally different people.
You're talking about Don Nixon.
Talking about Don Nixon Sr.
Yeah.
And Mark Honeywell, as Glenn Bowman would know. And I didn't know the two men. They were totally different. But Mr. Honeywell had gone out of town. And there was a fire downtown real fast. And Mr. Nixon went down there physically with a crew and moved all his files and records up to the train delay and kept it from going until he got back. So history has it that Mr. Honeywell was so grateful that when he was killed, he turned right around and did the same thing for Mrs. Nixon. Stepped in and gave her every healthy fuss he could. So I thought that would have been in the records.
No, I had never heard that story. Did you have any other personal glimpses of Mrs. Honeywell as to her human side rather than her business
human
side?
side, you know, I used to, knowing that she'd been a fine pianist, I was the one who would always say, "Night you play," because I just enjoyed sitting there and listening to her play. And then on the human side, when we finally bought out the other paper in Michigan City, and the new press is installed, and now comes out the first edition of the new combined paper, I was standing next to her and turned, and the tears were coming down her cheek. And I knew then that she wished that Don Nixon Sr. could have been here to see it. But this is the kind of a woman she was. And always interesting, and always helpful, and just a joy. And it was such a shock when I got the word in New York about her untimely death here. But I have a funny story for you about Mr. Honeywell. He had started to have his flower shows out here. And Mr. Honeywell was not always the easiest person to get along with. He had an idea he would do it his way regardless of anything else, about my experience. So came the year when I wanted a promotion, something going on in town, a drum up interest and juices flowing and the advertising flowing. And I heard that the gladiola growers were going to have their state meeting of the committee over in Peru. So I thought maybe I can get them to have a gladiola festival. They'd never had one before. So I went over. Wait all day. They let me sit in on the meeting, and I knew nothing about flowers. They kept talking about nomenclature. I thought that was the name of the chairman of the committee at the time. Yeah. And finally, they gave me my hearing. I sold them on coming to Walter. I said, "We got a fine armory there, and it's set up below. You can arrange all your flowers and everything." And I said, "Furthermore, Mr. Honeywell had told me, yes, Jerry, let's combine the two, and we'll have a double attraction." So that was the big selling point. And Mr. Honeywell would work with us. So I came back and I said, "Mr. Honeywell, what date would be convenient for you?" He wouldn't give me a date. Just absolutely got very stubborn. He wouldn't give me a date. So finally the gladiola growers are on the phone. "What's the date?" So finally I said to Harold Wolf, who was co-chairman with me, I said, "Let's just set a date." So we set a date. And then we got everything ready. And after we set the date, and we had all the promotion material printed without the Honeywell tie-in because we didn't have any authority. And Mrs. Nixon said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Can't you intercede for us?" He said, "On this case, we're just going to work it out himself." Then he announced the date, and the date was the same date as ours.
Yeah.
And people, were coming all over to see his, knowing nothing about ours, and vice versa. So Harold Wolf and I fixed him. We prepared signs the week before. In the morning of the big date, which was a Sunday, the entrance of 15 and 13 and 24, any road leading in the Wabash, there was a big sign with an arrow said, "Follow the arrow to the flower show." So we didn't say gladiola, we didn't say Honeywell. So, of course, the arrows all led them down to the armory. There they paid their 2 bits admission, saw ours, and then all the Honeywell people said, "Well, where's Mr. Honeywell?" He said, "That's 2 miles just up 15. And he never forgave me for that, but the gladiola festival went on for a long time, and his flower show, of course, is now continuing.
Yeah, I'm going to turn this tape here. We haven't talked about your family and your own personal family. Let's develop that. Well, again, thinking the great-grandchildren,
Yeah, that's true. Well, when I got to New York, I met a young woman who worked at Esquire. And eventually we got married. And now we have a 10-and-a-half-year-old son. And which was a rather late start in life for both of us. It turned out to be kind of funny in many instances. As soon as he was able to walk, I would take him around the neighborhood there in New York where we lived, on Saturday errands. So the first time around, we walked into the shoemaker, or the shoe repair place, and the man, of course, knew me from having lived there a number of years. And he said, "Oh, what a handsome grandson." And I said, "Mind your tongue, will you?" I said, "That's my son." Well, it was that way everywhere, at the grocery and everywhere else. So I came home and told Mrs. Jontry, and she howled with laughter. She thought that was very funny. And then one day it happened to her. And she was furious. She said, "How could I be that child's grandmother?" I said, "Because you could be, that's why."
Yeah.
So we've lived right there. People say that you can't bring children up in New York, and yet I'll show you a lot of fine children that are being raised there. Of course, there are many things that I wish he could have the room to roam around, like I as a kid. And of course, since he's been here in Wabash, he's been running all over the neighborhood and having a ball. And how much longer we'll stay there? Actually, my business could be run from anywhere. But as much as we're there and you establish friendships and business acquaintances, the food advertisers, who are my big category now, are really not located in New York. Most of them moved out. I think there are only a couple of big companies left. The General Foods is not there, and the Bisco, people like that. In the Middle West, of course, is where most of the food advertisers are. So, but we've had a wonderful life in New York, and we've managed through my business to go to Europe about 12 times, and we've been around the world, and so it gives you something to look back on. But one of the dearest spots, as I say, is Wabash.
You didn't tell me your wife's maiden name.
Oh, well, she's a McLaughlin out of a Fitzpatrick, so she's entirely ours all the way through. And I might tell you one funny story. She likes to go to church on Good Friday. She was raised Catholic, but has drifted away. So last Good Friday, she asked Jonathan if he would like to go with her. He said, sure, because he was out of school that day. So they get to the church, and there are only 2 seats left, one way down front and one in the back. And she said, would you like to sit down front? He said, sure, I'll go down. So for an hour, he listened to how poor Christ got it, the chops, the crucifixion and everything. He came on, she said, how did you like the services? He said, I liked it very much. She said, you really? She said, well, you know whom they were talking about. He says, of course, Nixon.
Pretty good. How about in your growing up, again, talking to your son or grandson someplace down the road? Tell me about the living around the house and what your mother cooked and how it was in the Christmas time and things of this nature as a young man his age.
Well, I have to think back. Of course, things were so different. There was no television to amuse yourself. And I remember our house in Chenal when I was his age. No one had central heating at that time. We had a big charcoal stove in our living room.
They won't believe you anyhow.
And they won't believe me, you're right. But I can remember that charcoal stove was a thing of beauty because it had transparent sides. And on a winter's night to look at that charcoal burning in there. And of course they heated the upstairs by, they'd have a ventilator in the ceiling, and so it would come up that way. But it seemed to me that winters used to be much more rugged in those days than it is now. I can remember having snow on the ground, from before Thanksgiving right through. But I saw the transition really from horses to motor cars, because they were around before I'd born, but not in any quantity. And I was telling Jonathan the other day that it was not an uncommon sight that farmers would come to town driving a mare who had a foal by her side, and the foal would not even be tied, because the little thing is not going to leave its mother. And of course he was fascinated to think somebody would drive a horse in with a little foal by its side. And living in New York, of course, he doesn't have access to a pony. And my father finally got me a pony one time. He bought it from an Amish minister who misled him slightly. He said the pony was only 4 years old, turned out to be 13. He said it was gentle, it was meaner than hell. But I got my pony, and I had that in Chenal. But the difference in growing up, the toys were all different. God, the toys today, the multitude of them. In those days, the simplest toys were the things that you got the most kick out of. And then he can't ride a bicycle in New York, which we used to ride, but my gosh, I got him a skateboard. The skateboard cost $40. My bicycle, my first new bicycle that I got from Sears and Roebuck didn't cost $40. Imagine, this is the way things have changed.
Yeah.
But you make lifelong friends when you're that age, and some of these fellows, even from 10 years old on, I still stay in touch with.
Yeah.
And but growing up in the prairie, and I didn't realize, I keep forgetting until I get back out here. You drive across this country and see the prairie land that we grew up in. And other children take an interest in history at different ages. And he's just now coming into the age when he wants to know everything about the very sort of thing we're talking about here. And fortunately, my sister is much better at this than I am, because she's kept records and things all through the years. But, for instance, on Halloween, he couldn't believe what we used to do on Halloween, because at that time everybody had outdoor toilets in the small towns. And, of course, the big event was to go around upsetting them. And he's fascinated to learn about that. He doesn't know what an outdoor toilet is. But at that time we didn't have any sewage systems or anything like that, so it was just a 3- and 4-holer that we used to have.
How did the family celebrate Christmas?
Well, in very much the same way. I mean, we would all get together and be all the cooking and everything else. And I really didn't pay that much attention to food, when you're growing up. But if you remember, it seemed like every woman was more or less a good cook. We always thought my mother was the best. And things would, Christmas time would come on, and the surprise element, of course, was like it is today. And eventually you learn there's no Santa Claus. It took me several years to forgive my sister, because she's the one that told me. And I imagine every family there's some dirty Eddie that has told you, there was no Santa Claus.
Yeah. How about first automobile? You remember when the family got the first car?
Yeah.
And what was it?
It was a Model T. And kept it at first in downtown in an old livery stable. And the livery stable had an incline to get into. And we'd come back on a Sunday night from visiting my grandmother down to London. And it would happen so often. You'd give it that last surge, to go up, and he'd burn out all the lights. Because that's the way it was. But then he got to keeping it near the house. But it was an open touring Model T car. And it was something. You'd ride those roads, and the dust would be so thick, you couldn't see through it. But to have a car in those days was exciting. And to learn to drive them, too. Of course, that was the days no one had to have a license. We learned to drive by just doing it. And it was a totally different world from the cars that we have today. And you had to crank them all. And there were a lot of broken arms every year, because this thing would kick back and hit you in here. But then, of course, we moved on to Galesburg. We had our first sedan, which was a Chevrolet. And that's where I really learned to drive, because I was in high school then. Those are the days of the rumble seats. We went down to see the new museum. Have you seen it at Indianapolis at the Speedway?
I haven't seen the new one.
Oh, it is absolutely beautiful. And there I could see a lot of those old cars. Of course, many of them way back beyond me.
Yeah.
But it was fascinating to see them.
Yeah. Did the family always have a telephone?
Oh, no, we didn't have a telephone. We didn't have a telephone all the years we lived in Chenal. It wasn't until we moved to Pontiac, a few years later, that we had a telephone. And you know what? We didn't miss it.
Yeah.
We didn't miss it at all.
Yeah.
Today, you would be absolutely lost without it.
Yeah. Do you remember the first radio?
Yes, the folks got an Atwater Kent. And I tell you, that was an experience. And furthermore, my father had the Atwater Kent for 40 years, and it was still working when I finally got the television set for him. But otherwise, that thing, he listened to it for 40 years.
That was a big event, the radio.
Oh, I should say it was. And of course, there were so many things they could do in radio that they can't do in television. They could create an illusion. In other words, as they talked with their sound effects and what, you visioned the whole thing. You visioned Jack Benny and the Willie's Overland. And you envisioned the fire chief, Ed Wynn, and all this thing. Now, unless it's an extremely well-done show, it can be ruined by what you see. But in radio, it was marvelous, because everything was was a mental image. Furthermore, you could do lots of things. You could cook and do repair work by listening to the radio. But with that too, you can't. You just sit there. Nothing gets done while you're watching.
Do you remember Lindbergh's flight and what happened?
Well, I remember Lindbergh's flight. I remember Lindbergh earlier, before his flight, because he was flying airmail from St. Louis to Chicago. And I don't know if you ever saw the movie or read the book about his experiences, but he was flying in that open cockpit plane with a sack of mail en route to Chicago to St. Louis, and he got in a terrible thunderstorm. He had to bail out. And he landed in Chenal. And that's where he caught the train to take the mail on into Chicago.
Yeah.
But then I remember I was in Galesburg, of course, when he flew the ocean. But I remember better his earlier episode over Chenal in the old days.
Did you see him on that when he bailed out, or?
Yeah, but I don't remember too much about it. I remember the talk around town. There were people down at the station waiting for him.
Mm-hmm.
But you see, in Chenal, it was wonderful because we had two railroads that crossed there. We had the CNA going north and south, and the TP&W going east and west.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember after we moved to Pontiac, I broke my arm on a bag swing, so my father had to take me to Peoria to have it reset because the local doctor said, look, I can't handle it. So we changed trains at Chenal, and who was the only other passenger in our coach but Williams Jennings Prime? So we had a full hour's visit with him going into Peoria. But when I think of the fun I had growing up, to hear my father tell the stories of the things they used to do, I used to envy him because I thought he had more fun than I did. Of course, having five brothers, makes a big difference, but they would hop trains, freight trains, go into Chicago and come back. So when they weren't all killed. And the comics, I don't know how it was in Wabash, but as a small boy living in a small town, the Sunday papers would come from Chicago. Now, they would stop in Wabash, or in Chenal. So as they neared Chenal, the baggage man would open up the baggage car door, and then as they hit Chenal, he would kick the papers out in bundles. Well, depending on the baggageman, if he kicked him far enough, you were fine. But if he didn't, and many's a Sunday morning, I'd walk 2 and 3 miles up the track to put all the pieces of the gumps together. Because there they would be, all cut up along the tracks.
Were you a paper boy, too?
Oh, sure. In Chenal, I carried the Pontiac. I was carrying all the Chicago papers, the Bloomington Pantograph. And I remember there was a man named Bradford who ran the drugstore, and he had the concession of the papers coming in. So I started to work for him, and one day, to show you the early labor problems, I went in and I said, Mr. Bradford, he was a wonderful man, and very active in state politics, but handsome. He looked like Warren Harding. And I said, Mr. Bradford, I said, I don't think it's fair that I should have to use my bicycle on this job. I think that you ought to supply a bicycle, even though I had a perfectly good bicycle. And he smiled, and he said, all right, Jerry, we'll take care of that. So a week later, for the other boy and I, we divided the time. There were 2 brand new bicycles. I said, I just one rule. He says, you'll have to come down to my house on the river and get the bicycles each morning. And then when you're through, you'll take the bicycles back. Well, that proved to be a real pain in the neck. I was sorry I ever struck for new bicycles because that took up extra time, to do that.
Getting to the end of the interview, you think of anything that you want to put in there. I want to ask you about the Depression. And what's your reflections? And of course, you were lucky you had a job all through the Depression.
Yeah, but I remember saying to my father when I was in high school before it hit, I said, when I'm going to college, I want to work my way through because I've seen men send their sons to college and come back, and some of them amount to nothing because they really didn't have to try to do anything. Well, I could have beaten my words because in 1929, I entered Chicago and the crash came within a week after I was there. So, indeed, I had to work my way through college but I'll tell you, it wasn't too bad. There were jobs, at least in the city, in the neighborhood, for part-time work, but everybody was in the same boat. No one had any money. Oh, there was a son of the President Marshall Field and another boy whose father had sold the market short, but everybody else was broke. And as long as you're all swimming in the nude, who cares who wears? And so we managed to get through. Lots of boys did. And that's why I've always felt that a boy who says he couldn't go to college because he couldn't afford. If he had to support his family, that's something else. But if he didn't have to support his family, there's no excuse for a child saying they can't get through. Today, there are many more scholarships than there used to be. Of course, the price has also gone up. Good heavens. I think my mother total the 4 years I was there, something like $200. Check now in for $5, bless your heart.
Yeah.
But my God, today it probably costs you $5,000 a year or more to go to school. A year.
Yeah. What was happening to the family at home? How were they making out there?
Well, he was in the paint factory, and they just sweated out. And finally, things began to catch hold again. But I could see men in Chicago. That's when they were selling apples on street corners. And that's right at the time. Well, in 1933, it was at the bottom. It was even worse. But I got a job immediately, and I got up there carrying Wall Street journals on LaSalle Street. They used to airmail the men. It cost $90 a year. Now, of course, they print them in Chicago, too. But that paid me $12 a week, George. Yeah. And that was phenomenal. Yeah. And I'd get up early in the morning at the fraternity house, go downtown, get the papers, and carry them. And the day of the crash, I was walking along delivering my papers to the brokerage house, and I was late. And I was just missed by a man who had jumped out of the 19th story of one building because he had been wiped out. Just wiped out. Men who had fortunes would be wiped out in the course of an hour. This is how fast that market was going down. And I tell you, it was just pandemonium. They called it Black Friday, I think it was, Black Tuesday.
Something like Black something.
Oh, it was just absolutely unbearable. And so when Esquire came along in 1933, they had the guts to charge 50 cents for a men's magazine. And there'd never been one before. But the day the boys went out with a dummy to sell advertising was the day Roosevelt closed the banks. They had to borrow dimes from people to call them into the office. And you used to see veterans from the war, selling apples on street corners. It was absolutely true. But just hordes and hordes of men would have their jobs. And there was no welfare, no relief, and no unemployment. And you can imagine what it did. Lots of men just ruined them for life.
Did you instead circle hard times?
Oh, sure.
That's great, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah, he developed that all through this technique.
Oh, did he? Talking to people?
Yeah, that's all he did. A couple other things before we finish up. How old did your parents live?
Well, my mother died of a heart attack at 72. My father went to 94. And all his brothers went over 90. And one of them still alive at 96. So,
and his parents had lived for a long time also.
Well, not that old, because people didn't in those days. But I think my grandfather was 80 when he died. And on my other side, they didn't live that long. But the Jontry boys seemed to have grabbed onto some key that kept them going all those years.
Where are they buried, your parents?
Well, my parents were buried in Galesburg.
In
Galesburg. And my uncles, of course, were all buried in Chenal. So they're all planted in Illinois. So you have your roots and you hang on to them as long as you can.
Do you have anything else that you would like to mention in here?
I was trying particularly to think about things at Wabash, you see, because, as I say, I had a quick 6.5 years through here, but there were 6.5 years that I've never enjoyed more in my life because there was just a lot of wonderful people here. I think I was, 27 or something when I was president of the Kiwanis Club. God, how heady can you get, on a thing like that? And then in the early days of the war, I remember a guy named Cooper who was head of the draft here. And when he heard that I had enlisted, he said, Jerry, that was ridiculous. We would never have picked you. I said, yes, that's what I was afraid of. And so I was 31, you see, when I left here to go into the Navy. And but that was the thing to do in those days. I actually thought the business of the plane dealer would drop off during the war because paper was going to be hard to get. Well, it was anything but drop off. Business was better than during the war because everybody was advertising. They weren't advertising goods, they were advertising drives and things like that. And I became a very close personal friend of Ike Duffy. I don't know whether you ever knew him. I noticed poor his brother, John, died this past week.
Right.
But Ike was that was one you should have had. That was one of the characters of all time in this county. He was a man who ran a string of stockyards. He dealt mostly in hogs. He was the biggest shipper in this area over to Pennsylvania. And he had his office in the Grove. And you never saw him around Wabash. He said he didn't have an old pair of overalls. He looked like he just came off the farm. But if you went anywhere else with him, he had his suits all made in New York. He was elegant. And then, of course, he went on, he had his own railroad over here for a number of years. He was crazy about railroading. And also he bought, I think he owned the Fort Wayne Piston. No, He owned the Fort Wayne basketball team at one time, but this is all after I left.
Yeah.
But Ike Duffy was a real character, and I loved it. He used to come down to Plain Dealer House. I'd be working there late at night, maybe 8:45. He'd come by in the overall house, and he'd tap on the window, and we'd go over and catch the last movie, he and I, because my wife would be gone at that time. And, we became very good, close personal friends.
Yeah, how about Merritt Sills?
Well, Merritt was on the paper when I came here, and of course I loved Merritt. And, he was tall and lean and homespun and devoted to his job. I don't think Merritt ever married, did he?
Late.
Oh,
Very
did he?
late,
Oh, did
yeah.
he? Well, he's not when I was here.
Mhm.
And he had a wry sense of humor, and he knew everything that was going on, and he could sit and knock out a story in no time at all. And I'd say, what do you think we should do here? And he said, what do you think? And so I'd say, fine. Well, it never came out the way I thought it would. It was always better. But Merritt was a lot of fun. I take it you knew Merritt.
Yeah.
Is he still living?
No,
Oh,
he died suddenly.
He was still living here when he died?
Right. Still working.
Really?
Yeah, when he died suddenly one afternoon.
We had an interesting thing happen on the Plain Dealer we talked about yesterday. At one time we had a morning paper called the Times Star.
Right.
And that would be the rural edition. Well, down in the basement of the bank was where the press was. And it had been turned off the night before, but it was all ready to go. And we had an electrical storm during the night. And somehow flashed a light and started the press. So we came down the next morning. The basement was filled with papers. It had just been running now for about an hour or two. We had enough papers that morning to cover southern Indiana.
Yeah. Okay. Would you have any reflections or advice or anything that you would say to your son as looking back over these years that you would want to pass on? Be listening to the tape someday.
Well,
But particularly since your family all lives in the 90s, why?
yeah. Well, I think he's going to find his ideas. The friends you have that make your life, because very few men can live alone. And friendship is a two-way street. And I think one of the greatest examples of it is Glenn Bowman. He's befriended people, and he has made friends, and everybody. I think if you can say to a child that the greatest thing could be said about you is if people would speak well of you, it gives you a goal, and it helps you keep your eye. Of course, we didn't have problems growing up with drugs and this sort of thing. And I think it was largely because it was easier then to teach values to children than it is today, because they get very confused with everything that's bombarded at them. In those days, life was slower, and you can make a deeper impression on the child, I think, than you can now. It's very difficult when you're competing with that, competing with everything else, to give a child. And if a child doesn't have values to guide them, then life is rugged for them. No question.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Well, George, it's a pleasure. I don't know what that's going to be of any interest to your collection down there.
I hope so. This is George Dingledye, interviewer.